Hello, welcome to the Museum of the Riverina, for those of you who haven't been here before. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we are on Wiradjuri land and recognising that they are the traditional owners. I'd also like to thank Madeline and the rest of the team here at the museum for all the support and encouragement they've given me over the past few months as I've been working on the project. I would also like to thank my family for their patience and love. As my mother will agree, it's been quite an emotional journey and I haven't always been nice to be around. But it's a journey that I'm not quite finished with yet, but it's all coming together nicely. So as Peter and Henry mentioned, my name is Claire McMullen and I am the 2013 recipient of the Powerhouse Museum's Movable Heritage Fellowship. And if Michael would like to change the slide, which as you can see on the slide is aimed at supporting cultural heritage organisations across New South Wales to record, preserve and display their collections for the benefit of regional communities. Tonight I will be talking about the Charlie Wong Hing collection that was donated to the museum in late 2012 by Mrs. Wendy Hucker, whom some of you may know through her work with the Pioneer Women's Hut in Tumbarumba and her family's continued legacy through the Haven and 2WG, Wagga's first and only commercial radio station. I'll talk about Charlie and his relationship with Wendy and her family a little later, but first I thought I would provide a bit of background information about myself and then talk about Charlie, incorporating the different bits and pieces that have led up to this point. There will be time for questions at the end, so I might get you to wait until then if you don't mind. And if you could change the slide, please. Okay, so a condition of applying for the fellowship is that the recipient must be studying a relevant degree at a tertiary institution, which I am. I am in my third and final year at Macquarie University, studying a Bachelor of Science in the Faculty of Arts, Department of Geography, majoring in Museum Studies, which is as hard as it sounds. But basically I am learning everything from the everyday running of a museum, the different roles within the sector, how to put an exhibition together, as well as hands-on experience through internships and volunteer work. As part of the course, I have also expanded out into environmental studies, finding an inner greenie, much to my grandfather's displeasure. I've also looked at Indigenous studies, learning how a Western approach to representing and remembering a culture isn't always the best way, as well as delving into modern history and European studies. So in early 2013, I applied for the fellowship with the support of Madeline and Jen Mott, who unfortunately couldn't be here tonight, and my attention was drawn to the Charlie Wong Hing collection, which, as I mentioned before, was donated to the museum by Wendy Hucker. The collection that Wendy donated consists of 114 documents, which include letters, photographs, some of which are featured in our presentation tonight, and legal documents. The letters are all from Charlie's son, Gurong, in China, and are written to Charlie and Wendy Hucker. The initial task of my fellowship has been getting the letters translated from Cantonese into English because sadly primary school Chinese didn't give me enough skills. Kathy Churchman from ANU kindly provided the translation for me. She is studying the languages and the history of China under the tutelage of Dr. Barry McGowan, who has done tremendous research into the Chinese in the Riverina and is the author of Tracking the Dragon, copies of which you can find at either museum. The letters make for an interesting read and have revealed and illuminated the ongoing relationship Charlie's son and his own two sons had with the Hucker family and their desire to come to Australia, which sadly never came to fruition. But we'll get to that later because, as Lewis Carroll once said, we must begin at the beginning. Charlie Wong Hing's life is one of many mysteries. The mix of factional and fictional makes for an interesting and thought-provoking history, but it is also a story with as many plot holes as a science fiction movie, which when you're trying to piece together the story can become quite frustrating. I like to think of Charlie's story as a novel, except a novel that someone spilled coffee on and they could only save a chunk from the middle and then the 2 chapters at the end. And then magically the coffee turned it all into Cantonese. Like I said, plot holes. But enough with the metaphors. It is thought that he came to Australia twice, the first time possibly escaping as a political refugee after one of the 2 failed uprisings in his province in the rural south of China, which you can see on the map. Yep. Why he left Australia and why he returned a second time remain a mystery also, although it is believed that he jumped ship at Sydney Heads sometime in the early 1900s and made his way to Wagga, where he claimed the identity of a Chinese market gardener who had passed away. While there are no records of Charlie's birth, it is estimated that he was born in either 1879 or 1889, which would mean that he was still less than 30 years of age by the time he reached Australia and Wagga, making his own start in the market garden business in North Wagga, becoming one of close to 4,000 market gardeners operating in the Riverina. Charlie had a good rapport with his customers, and as Mr. Frank Reinhardt, formerly of North Wagga, who knew Charlie before he met the Robert family, remembers, he was always neat and tidy and easy to understand, opting for Western clothes also. Charlie would often tell him to stay away from the bad Chinese men, a group of men that lived together in a tin shed on the North Wagga flat. What these men did was never fully explained by Charlie, but he would make a point of telling his European friends that there were Chinese that were good and there were Chinese that you stay away from. I believe that these bad Chinese probably affiliated themselves with the communists who Charlie did not trust and did not like. Although Charlie was well liked by his customers in North Wagga and was, by his own definition, a good Chinese man, there was still an underlying sense that he was an outsider, someone who did not quite fit the mould of a 19th century rural Australian town. It was perhaps his own understanding of this that led him to form such a bond with Mr. Eric Roberts, Wendy's adoptive father. Charlie had a very good business in North Wagga, but on occasion he would take some of his produce a few kilometres up the street to the start of Fitzmaurice Street. It was on one such occasion that he met Eric Roberts, a local man who, somewhat like Charlie, was not understood within the community. Charlie would sell Mr. Roberts his fruit and vegetables, and from here a friendship that was to span several decades was born out of a mutual understanding of one another. On one occasion, Mr. Roberts went to buy his vegetables, only to discover that Charlie was not there that week because his horse had died and he was not able to transport his vegetables himself. Legend goes that Mr. Roberts, upon discovering that the horse had died, brought Charlie a new one, repaying a debt he owed Charlie for giving him free produce when he himself had fallen on hard times. The friendship was to last until Mr. Roberts died in 1962 and was one of mutual respect, founded on a deep understanding of one another. As part of my project, I have had the very good fortune and opportunity to interview and record the memories of people who knew Charlie and were somehow connected to his story. I think it is important to note that this is where most of my information comes from, and as such, on one hand, it is hard to create an objective historical narrative from subjective information, but on the other, without the memories of these people, we would have no story, and the significance of the collection would be lost. After having the bulk of the letters translated, I felt it would be a good time to speak further with Wendy and talk about the content and detail of the letters, and delve further into the story of Charlie, because as with any language barrier and the social and cultural restraints of the time, there is ambiguity in what was left unsaid or not interpreted. Wendy recalls in one of our interviews, Robbo wasn't popular, he was on the outer in Wagga, and so I guess Charlie Wong was a bit of an outside person too, and maybe, I don't know, maybe that was part of the friendship. In the interwar years, Mr. Roberts found Charlie a job growing vegetables on the Uranquinty Air Force Base, about 30 kilometres out of town. Robbo got him a job with the Air Force, and he used to say to me what a good job it was because he taught them how to play fan-tan, and so he would work at the Air Force Base during the day growing vegetables, presumably for the base, and at night he'd win money at fan-tan. So he thought that was a really good job. He couldn't believe it, calls Wendy. And just as a little aside, fan-tan is a game that was very popular with the Chinese, especially in America, and I looked it up this morning and it's similar to roulette, but it's been overtaken by other Chinese games like mahjong and things. Mr. Roberts, an entrepreneur at heart, found success by creating Wagga's now iconic 2WG radio station, which opened in Baylor Street, Wagga on the 29th of June 1932. At this stage, Charlie was still selling vegetables at the Air Force Base and in town when he could, but he still had a firm friendship with the Roberts family. While still owning and operating the radio station in Wagga, Mr. Roberts, his wife Nan, or Auntie Nan as per her radio personality, along with Wendy, bought a property called Clear Springs on the outskirts of Jingellic near the Victorian border and a house in Hunters Hill, Sydney, spending time between the three. Charlie, whose contract with the Air Force had ended, moved on to Clear Springs fairly soon after Robert's purchase and was seen as a caretaker, becoming Mr. Roberts' most trusted eyes and ears on the ground. While he was given no official title and did not live in the family home, Charlie held the responsibility of reporting back to Mr. Roberts about the happenings on the property while he was away on business. Clear Springs is a significant physical setting because it is one of the main cultural landscapes of Charlie's life, providing the major backdrop to our story and adding another layer of significance. And I know you're all wondering what significance is, and when we refer to it in the museum sector, we're referring to the values and meanings that items and collections have for people and communities. Significance helps to unlock the potential of collections, creating opportunities for communities to access and enjoy collections and to understand the histories, cultures and environments of Australia. Charlie was not expected to work with the livestock or the daily running of the property, but he did keep a vegetable garden at the back of the house where he continued his tradition of growing vegetables. Wendy remembers Charlie wanting to cook for the family when they visited, as they spent most of their time in Hunters Hill, but as Wendy says, they discouraged that because his cooking was less than favourable. He would make eggs and rabbit for the workers though, including Dick Hall, one of the longest serving managers at the property. Charlie was not confined to Clear Springs, often coming into town with the Roberts to run his own errands and drop into the radio station. It was on one such occasion that he met Yvonne Braid, now Councillor Braid, who had one of her first jobs at 2WG. Charlie struck up a firm friendship with Yvonne, charging her to send some of his salary that he earned from his work at Clear Springs to his son in China. Charlie was staunchly anti-communist and did not trust that his money was making it to his family, so he sent small increments via Melbourne and then via Hong Kong, ensuring that the majority of his money made it to his son and later to his two grandsons, who join our story later. As far as Wendy and Yvonne can recall, Charlie never went to Melbourne himself, preferring Sydney, where he would go to visit the Roberts and play Fan-Tan, one of his great passions. Wendy recalled one such visit to Sydney in our last interview, and you can read her memory on the slide. While he never went to Melbourne, Charlie often spoke of an uncle who lived there, and it was through this uncle that much of Charlie's correspondence came. Wendy recalls Charlie's uncle visiting Clear Springs only once, a lone figure walking across the paddocks towards the homestead. It is believed that the man caught the train and then the bus to Holbrook and walked the rest of the way, which is fairly impressive considering that my uncle from Melbourne looked like this. Not exactly a spring chicken, and for anyone who has travelled that way, not exactly flat terrain. Charlie's uncle only stayed one night and they locked themselves away in a room at Clear Springs, talking most of the night away. Despite many offers from the Roberts and other workers on the property, Charlie's uncle left on foot early the next morning, and Charlie never spoke of what they discussed. Through my research, I have come up with a few possibilities for the reason of Charlie's uncle's visit. The first is purely that Charlie and he had financial matters to discuss. After all Charlie's business was sent via his uncle in Melbourne. However, one thing that jumped out at me as I was talking about Charlie with various people in the community was that he often spoke of his son, who he had actually never met in person because he was either travelling or already in Australia at the time of his birth. But he never spoke of his son's mother, presumably his wife. We have no evidence of a marriage, so it is one more of those coffee-stained pages. But one conclusion I have drawn is that perhaps Charlie's uncle came to see him in person to tell him that the mother of his child had passed away. But yes, he left the next day, back over the hills, and continued to write to Charlie late into his life. The years were kind to Charlie, and he spent a good few more years at Clear Springs before moving into the Haven, another now defining part of Wagga's history that was founded by the tireless work of the Roberts family and different communities associated with 2WG. I am told that Charlie enjoyed life in the Haven playing Fan-Tan, and even in a small rural town he got along with everyone. Charlie had a unique unifying presence, making everyone around him feel welcome. Charlie was well loved at the Haven and was again relied upon by Mr. Roberts to really tap into what the community there wanted. The only kerfuffle came a couple of years before Charlie died, when he decided to become naturalised. It was thought that it would come out that he was here illegally and that he would be deported. Luckily, this didn't happen, and Charlie was able to be naturalised before he passed away of old age on November the 29th, 1969. According to the Daily Advertiser at the time, he was aged approximately 84 years, but I believe he was probably closer to 90. Charlie's death did not mark the end of his legacy. He named Wendy Hucker as executor of his estate and charged her with sending money that he left, a sum of around $12,000, onto his son, whose name is Wong, in China, in instalments, again via Hong Kong. Wong wrote to Mrs. Hucker after Charlie's death, and their correspondence spanned 2 decades. These letters to Wendy are what make up the bulk of our collection and detail Wong's adventures in getting passports and visas for his own 2 sons to come to Australia. Wong mentions that it would be far easier to get to Australia if they had a family connection, and asks Wendy to say that Charlie and Mr. Roberts had a very close connection and were in fact related, saying in a letter dated the 30th of June 1981, "First, we need to have a familial relationship. Second, the value of the property and business that my father left behind in Australia, and you can overestimate this, in a definitive amount written. Third, the place where my sons would live when they move to Australia in the future. You can say they would live in your village, but you should write the address clearly. Fourth, the necessity of my 2 sons going to Australia to continue Wong Hing's business." He then goes on to ask Wendy to list them as family, stating that their fathers had a very close relationship and that Charlie was a father figure to her. It is interesting to note that at this point, from this point on, Wong stops addressing letters with "Dear Mrs. Hucker" and starts addressing them as "My dear sister Wendy," perhaps a telling sign that they were expecting something more of Wendy. Wendy herself believes that Wong and his family may have misunderstood Charlie's role on Clear Springs, mistaking him to be a landowner or as owning the land on which he gardened. From their perspective, it would have seemed like Charlie had lived a rich and full life, which he did, but not in the sense that he was monetarily wealthy. Wendy believes that they thought they were entitled to some land on Clear Springs, as they imply in their letters, but this was not the case. Wong's letters to Wendy are an interesting read. He has no real bond with any of the people that he is writing to, especially his father Charlie, who he never met. But he is still most respectful, beginning each letter to his father as, "To my most respected father, down on my knees," even asking Charlie if he approved of the name he had chosen for his newborn son. Because Wendy herself was not convinced that the money was reaching China, she decided to take a trip there and make it out to Charlie's village to meet his son and grandchildren herself. In our interview, she spoke of the trip and how it was a disappointing one for both parties. You can read Wendy's memories up on the slide, but the abridged version is that Charlie's family had asked for Rolex watches, fans and radios, but Wendy didn't receive the letter in time and had bought the rest of Charlie's belongings and a few things she thought they would need, which they appreciated, but it wasn't what they wanted. Wendy said that she and her sister, who she had travelled with, wanted to spend the night in the village, but they got the sense that the family was embarrassed by their home's lack of toilet, and the language barrier was proving very difficult without a translator. So they travelled 4 hours back to where they were staying and then eventually came back to Australia. Upon her return, Wendy, as sole executor, continued to send the remaining money on in small increments, but letters between Wendy and China became sporadic, eventually stopping altogether, with the last letter to Wendy in our collection dated the 24th of July, 1990. That date kind of marks the end of what we know about Charlie and his son, and is a sad end to their story. But as part of my research, I have been assessing the significance of Charlie's stories and Wong's letters, and it may seem a story that has little importance beyond the local, but in the words of Wendy herself, "History is often seen as belonging to the rich and famous, but in the end, history is not about great events and famous people. It is about ordinary people and their everyday lives. This is what makes us Australians." I think that some interesting parallels can be drawn between Charlie's grandsons wanting to come to Australia and the current political situation regarding immigration, and how sadly many people never make it to Australia. There is also some literature that suggests Chinese communities were very hard to engage with if you were not already part of the fold, and that they kept very much to themselves and their known trade circles. I believe that Charlie, because of his friendship with Eric Roberts, was able to operate in both worlds, that of the Chinese market gardeners and that of the Western world, and maybe even bridged a gap between the two. While the friendship between the two might not be considered normal, you know they didn't call each other up and go to the club for lunch or anything, but they both respected and wanted the best for each other. And with Charlie's unique ability to get along with everyone, the argument could be made that Charlie and his friendship with Mr. Roberts was the foundation stone for Wagga becoming such a diverse and multicultural city. I believe that the story of Charlie, told in conjunction with the letters from his son, will give not only people in Wagga a better understanding of their own local history, but a better understanding of the larger historical narrative at play and Wagga's part in that story. The significance of Charlie Wong Hing and his family will resonate with other communities in Australia as it speaks of cultural diversity, immigration, friendship, separation and inclusion and the dream of a better life. And that's it.